Good morning. This is Pastor Becca here on this Wednesday morning. I want to share a word from the Lord with you from Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27 this morning. Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. I think this will be a familiar story for many of us. So Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. Hear the word of the Lord. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." And this is the word of the Lord for us this morning. Thanks be to God. For the Jewish people, water, especially large bodies of water, were thought of as very dangerous. The waters seemed very chaotic. There was no shortage of danger that could come from these waters. You really didn't know what was lurking within the deep waters. A storm could come up at any time, and especially with the boats that they had in those days, you really stood very little chance out on the waters in the midst of a powerful storm. And so waters were to be feared. Water was chaotic. It was dangerous. You were kind of caught up in the waters if you were out there in a boat in the midst of the storm. There was very little that you could do about it. And no one knew this better than fishermen. Fishermen who made their livelihood out on the water, fishing in their boats, letting down their nets day after day. They knew better than anyone the dangers that these waters presented. They knew how quickly a storm could come up and catch you off guard out there in the middle of the lake. They knew, they had heard so many stories about what could possibly be lurking in the waters. They had seen the chaotic nature of water. They had felt that feeling of feeling so small out there in the midst of the water and really feeling powerless in that moment to do anything to save yourself. And really throughout Scripture, we see this idea that water is chaotic, water is dangerous, water is powerful. No one really can control water. No one can really stand a chance against it. And yet, throughout Scripture, God is portrayed as one who can speak but a word, and the wind and the waves obey. You think about in the beginning in Genesis, we're told that the Spirit hovered over the chaotic waters. All that was there in the beginning was chaos. There were these dark, chaotic waters, and the Spirit just hovered above those waters. But if you remember from the creation story, God speaks but a word and begins to bring order to that chaos. God brings light. God begins to separate those waters. Dry land appears. So even in the very beginning, God is able to hover over those chaotic waters and speak but a word, and order starts to come from those chaotic waters, from that chaotic nothingness that was in the emptiness in the beginning. And we see Jesus have that same sort of power here in Matthew's gospel. He and his disciples are out on the lake. A storm comes up, and they're out there in this little boat, and it's a powerful storm, and there's really not a lot they can do about it. And the disciples are panicked. They are very afraid that their lives are soon going to come to an end. They are very afraid that these waves are going to overtake this small boat that they're in, and they're going to meet their end. And yet Jesus is in this very peculiar position. Jesus isn't panicked with the rest of them. He's not running around trying to figure out a way to make it through this storm. He doesn't have buckets and throwing the water out of the boat. Instead, Jesus is sleeping. Jesus is in this moment of peace and calm when this chaos is just breaking out among him, around him. And the disciples come and they wake Jesus up. And they don't you know what's going on? Lord, save us. We're going to drown. And Jesus says something very interesting to them. He says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And then just as the word was spoken in the beginning, Jesus speaks but a word here out on this lake amongst the chaotic waters. And the lake immediately becomes calm. The wind and the waves die down. The lake is just completely calm. It is peaceful again, just that quickly. Goes from chaos to order once again, just in one spoken word from Jesus. I think this is a really good reminder for us today. We tend to live in a world where there are chaotic waters all around us. We find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic facing some chaotic waters even now. And it's so easy for us to be like the disciples and to be scrambling around trying to fix the situation, to have the buckets and to be throwing the water overboard and to be panicked and frightened and overcome with fear. And yet it's this beautiful reminder that we have this God who can speak but a word, and the wind and the waves obey him. We have a God who can speak but a word and bring order to the midst of chaos. Now, it doesn't mean that God always speaks that word immediately. It doesn't mean that things always happen in the ways that we expect them to. I'm sure the disciples would have preferred Jesus have woken up before they were up in their frightened state. And yet we serve this God who is the Lord over all creation. To speak but a word and order comes to chaos. To speak but a word and the wind and the waves obey. We serve this powerful God. And one of the things that I would like to encourage us for our practice today is just to spend some time in awe of that God. To remember that we serve the God of all creation, to remember the power that our God has, even in the midst of the chaos, even in the midst of the stormy seas that might be overpiling on our boat right now. We serve a God who is Lord over all things. And our God is one that we can trust. Our God is one that we can trust. The storm will not overcome us. The chaos will not have the last word. We have a God who brings order from chaos and calm from the storm. Friends, may the peace of Christ be with you today. May you sense the presence of the risen Christ in a very real way. And may you trust that we serve a God who is even Lord over the wind and the waves. Blessings.